Okay, I think we're at halacha chaf aleph. An onion that you uprooted in Shmita and you planted it in the 8th year, and then the thing that grew out of it, maybe it means stalks, bigger than it originally was, or than the ball of it. So these new growth that happens, bring it up. Literally, halu is bring it up. So it means it brings it out of a state of Isser, because it was picked, I guess, on Shmita, and now the whole thing becomes mutter, even from the ball. Just like Shmita makes it prohibited through the karka, through the ground, also taking it through the ground. So the lashon, the language of the Rambam is a little bit strange here, but it means that netilasa, taking away the prohibition, can also take through the growth. So the Ravid argues and says you can't. The fact that you replanted it and more grew, because again, this is an onion. So onions, it could be picked for out and then replanted and it works, but you cannot make the onion permitted this way. Because if you would never have picked it in the first place and it would have grown more in the 8th year, it wouldn't, the additional growth wouldn't have negated the original growth, since the growth was included from the original planting, which was from Shmita and prohibited. Unless you completely took them out before Shmita the whole year, and we spoke about storing them a certain way. We're in the middle of halacha chaf aleph 21. That you didn't want the growth to nullify the Isser. But if you didn't do that, then defected it grows more. It doesn't negate the prohibited part of it, which was from when it growing on Shmita. And the Rash says in Perek Vav Mishnah Gimel and the Tosfos Rosh Nedarim say, as long as the onions are still there, and you could recognize what was original and what was additional, then the new growth doesn't negate the prohibited growth. So again, I think this is more talking about like more stalks are growing up from the onion, because obviously the ball isn't going to change so much. So the only way it would be mutter, says the Rash, is if you ground it up until you can't tell them apart what was asur and what was mutter. Then the fact that it more grew in the 8th year in a prohibited way, then it negates the original prohibited part of it. And bittul barov, nullification through the majority, that the majority is from the new growth, only works in this case when it grew more after Shmita. But if the whole growth was on Shmita, it doesn't help even chopping it up, or grinding it up, I should say. So we see from what Rav Kook brings down is that the Rambam's opinion in this case is among the most lenient of all the Rishonim. The fruit that grow on trees on Shmita. So obviously, we've been talking about for most of this case about tzvichim, things that were growing, things that were already growing by themselves, plants like vegetables or legumes or onions, things in the ground that grew. But trees, we know that trees are going to grow by themselves on Shmita, and those certainly are not prohibited. So that stuff which grows on trees, which certainly is prohibited, you're not allowed to harvest it in the normal way. He says the word gathering, just in case there's a difference. Rambam says yasvim, which is gathering them. As the pasuk says, the grapes of your chosen whatever you cannot tzivtzor, which means cut in the harvest way, harvest in the normal way. And if you harvested as a work of the elan, so in that case, I think we would call that pruning. or you harvested the way that the regular wine harvesters harvest, you receive lashes from on a Torah level. So says Rav Kook, the Rash in the 8th chapter Mishnah Vav says that the main part of this prohibition to not gather fruits that you get in the same way you gather them every other year is only if it was in a guarded field. Because remember, part of Shmita is you have to treat your land ownerless. So you can't have a fence or this or that, or if you have a fence, you don't have to take it down, but you have to leave the gates unopened. I think there's a machlokus if you can guard them some of the time, but not all the time, if that works or not. But the Rash says this is only if the field was not kept in an ownerless open state, then you're not allowed to harvest it. But if you left it in an unguarded state, then you're allowed to cut the grapes off normally, or the fruit normally. And this is an additional prohibition besides from the fact that he nullified the mitzvah of Shmitas Peros, meaning you have to leave it ownerless, and number two, you can't harvest it the normal way. That's what the Rash holds. However, says the Rash, that if you made it all ownerless according to the din, and then everyone comes and takes grapes for their families, then you're allowed to cut it even in the regular harvesting method. And even the owner himself is allowed to take it just like anyone else, meaning he has as much ownership as anyone else, but not more, meaning because he kept it ownerless. So then he could also cut it in a normal way. Tosfos in Rosh Hashanah says, if the field was guarded, you're not allowed to harvest it at all. And you're only allowed to harvest in an unusual way is if you kept the field ownerless. And the Vilna Gaon says that if the grapes or the fruit is still connected to the tree, you're not able to harvest it in any way, even if it was made ownerless. The only thing that you're allowed to, this Mishnah that says that something's permitted by doing something differently, does not apply to something that already detached. Excuse me, this Mishnah is only talking about things that are already detached from the tree. That you're not allowed to do things to detached fruit except through a different matter, but to separate it from when it's growing, you have to do just hand picking. You can't use any type of tool. Yes. So even if you acquired, in general, even if you acquired the fruit in a permitted way, you're prohibited from selling it. But we saw that, like, if you harvested the regular amount and then your son sells it, that's okay. But again, when you, in those cases, when you sell it, it can't be sold in the regular way. You can't use, by measure or by weight or by count. And when you when you sell it, the kedusha transfers to the money also. The money that it pays also has kedusha streets. Okay, 23.
So would that apply to nuts also that grow on trees?
Nuts, except peanuts, nuts are all like they grow on a tree. So what we just said in this halacha would apply to nuts. I don't know. I've seen from the car, Yisrael Bar Meir pointed out to me that there's the almond tree, the shkedia, but I've never seen a nut tree up close. And peanuts would be also because they're like kitnias, they're like beans because they grow in the ground. So whatever, it's very strict, and it whatever applies to Svichen applies to peanuts also.
Yeah, I mentioned to you that we were on in this yeshuv, and we walked outside, and there were almond tree grows all in bloom, and there were tons of people there. Now they were in bloom, but the fruit, it wasn't. The almonds weren't quite ready yet.
Right.
But they're not guarded. They're not fenced in. So all those people, a week after we were there, 2 weeks after, could just pick stuff, right?
Right. So I don't know what tool they usually use for harvesting. So according to the Rambam, it seems according to anyone, you're not allowed to harvest it in the normal way. According to the Rash, you could pick it in the normal way as long as you don't pick the whole tree. You pick what your family needs for a couple of days, whatever. According to Tosos and Rosh Hashanah, you can you could cut it, but in an unusual manner or an unusual tool. And according to the Vilna Gaon, you'd have to pick them by hand.
Thank you.
So it seems to be 4 opinions here, according to Rav Kook. 23. V'chetzed yas oseh. So how do you deal with these fruits? Ta'enim shel shvius. Pigs of Shmita in Kotzelhem b'muktzeh. You don't use the regular bladed tool that you usually use. Excuse me. So there's a machlokus in the Mishnah among the commentators of the Mishnah if this is talking about the tools or it's talking about a place. The Rambam clearly holds it's talking about a place. You don't dry them out in the regular drying plates of a miyapshin b'chorba. You just take an uninhabited house and just dry them out there. So Rav Kook brings this in the middle, but we'll just read the whole halacha straight. You're not allowed to squeeze or press the grapes in the wine press of a derchu bareva. You could do them in a smaller container. Obviously, it's wine presses were big. There's pictures from in Gush Etzion, the ancient wine press. It's stone and it's big, so you could use something smaller, like a smaller trough. And squeeze and step on them there, except for anyone who went to Old Wrigley to Wrigley Field. You don't like troughs at all. They're very unsanitary, right? And you cannot you can't crush the olives in the regular place where there was the press for the olives. That's the bad was the olive press. You can crush them. Obviously with some other tool in an unusual way, and you have to put it in a very small container. And you can grind them in. So I don't know exactly if he's talking about here about two different levels of oil. So first you press it, and those are the highest quality oil, and then you crush the olives, and you get more oil, but it's a lower quality. So like that stuff you couldn't use for the menorah in the Beis Hamikdash. So in regard to doing the crushing type squeezing, betochen, the word tochen is like you grind them in the Beis Habad, which is the olive pressing house, of a kotev. Umachnas levad katana, and then you put them in a very small olive press. So again, I don't know if he's saying you're allowed to do it in the regular olive press facility, but then it doesn't go into the regular container. I don't know what the difference is for olives. And for any other things, because obviously the Mishnah and the Rambam are talking about only about wine and olives, because those are the most things that were pressed. Well, they would dry fruit, so he talked about drying fruit, and then processing grapes was to make wine, he mentioned, and to process olives into oil, he mentioned. Now, in regard to other things, does he mean that you're not allowed to thresh and winnow and grind wheat into flour in a regular way? I don't know. Okay, Rav Kook. The Rambam in the Pirush Mishnah in the 7th chapter, Mishnah Bab says, you're not allowed to dry the fruit out in the regular and best place that you usually do that the other years of the calendar, but you have to dry them out in an uninhabited building, which is meaning It says uninhabited building, you're not going to do it in your house because you're living in your house. So it means a place that's not the normal place for processing and drying out these fruits. And by doing it in a different place, there's a shino, there's something different. And the aruch, which was a very early Rishon, which was like a dictionary type thing, which also gives explanations, and Tosfos quotes the aruch thing, says that this is it doesn't say that he disagrees with the Rambam that it's talking about place of doing it, but he says you actually use a different tool. You're not allowed to cut it with the regular fig knife that people would harvest figs with. You cut them with a different type of knife, which is kamin cherev, like a sword. So I guess it's longer, so it's harder to deal with because it's too big. But it's also could be it's a different shape. Meaning, let's say if the normal blade would be some type of curved blade, and now you're using something straight, that's also a shino. I don't know which one of those the aruch means. And the Mishnah, and I keep forgetting this. Malacha Shlomo says that you dry out the figs. Normally, when you dry out the figs, you take out the ukits, which is where it was connected to the tree, and there was a special tool for doing this. And at Shmita, you're not allowed to do that in order to be a shinoi. So he learns a slightly different explanation. And then you don't crush the grapes in a regular wine press. I don't know if Yoni Blumoff, who made wine in his bathtub, I don't know if he on Shmita he'd be allowed to do it in his bathtub as if it's his normal way. I don't know. And I don't mean Yoni's, I'm not picking on Yoni, I'm doing people who did you have any of his of it, Marty? Or only Maury was a victim of it? So maybe I'll text Yoni and ask him if he knows what the halacha would be for that. Figs of Shmita, you're not allowed to make them into a pressed fig cake, but you're allowed to dry them out. So one way of dealing with these figs, they would dry it out. The way that I visualize it is if you go to a treif deli and they have these big round cakes of cheeses. So I figure that these dried fig things were something big like that they would put a lot of dates and they would dry together and they would last a long time. I don't know if they actually how much they dried out of it, some level of dryness, but you're not and that was, I guess they were able to stay for a long time in those cakes, but you could use, I guess you could only have individually dried ones. And we already explained that's based on the Tosefta. We already explained that for what we said in the previous halacha applies to this. According to the Rash, the prohibition's only if the field were guarded. But if the field was unguarded, the whole Shmita, you're allowed to do everything the normal way. So the Rash would not agree with the Rambam in this halacha. But some say that these all apply, even if it was a completely made ownerless for Shmita, and if it was a field that was not made ownerless, you would have to even be stricter than this. Other details which Rav does not elaborate on. Okay, Chaf Daled, we're going to it's the same topic, but it's kind of not the order we would think it's. Mitzvahs asay lahashmit kol ma shetot earth b'shvius. There's a positive commandment from the Torah to make ownerless anything that the land lets out on Shmita. This translation that we have, I believe, says divest oneself. Is that what it says? So, I mean, like I think I mentioned, the only time the Torah mentions Shmita is in regard to canceling loans. But in regard to the agriculture thing, it never says the word Shmita. It's always Shvius. And the Mishnah is called Shvius. And at the last chapter or two of Shvius talks about canceling loans. And that's what we talk about Prusbal. But it says Lahashmit. As the pasuk says, Vashvius tishmetano natashta. Whoever lacks his vineyard or I guess walls his field, and the seventh year has negated this positive commandment. If you would harvest your whole crop into your field, he mentions peros. Peros literally means fruit, but it could mean produce. It could be, non-fruit stuff also. But then you have the different shaila of sveichen. which we discussed for several weeks, which is not so a lot of intricate details. Ella yafkar kol, you have to make everything ownerless. V'yad hakol shava b'chol malkom, and everyone has equal opportunity towards it. Everyone is considered equal, even if they come from somewhere else. Doesn't matter if you're close, if you're far. Shenamar va'achlu evnei amachas. The pasuk says the poor people of your nation will eat from it. You could bring a little bit into your house, just like people could bring from ownerless. 5 jugs of oil, 15 jugs of wine. And if you brought more, it's mutter, but it's not something that you should do. Even if you made a fence around your field and locked up your vineyard on condition to distribute it afterwards to poor people, that is still prohibited, as the Kesef Mishnah explains on the Rambam, based on the Mechilta. And the halacha should have been that you would have to take down the walls or take down the fence to show that it's mutter. But the Chachamim said you don't have to do this because tikkun olam. So tikkun olam is so society can function normally. It would be a big loss if you'd have to do that and then rebuild it after Shmita. So as long as it was there from before, we let you keep it up. Obviously, you can't lock it. But if you actually do an act to show that your ownership over it, like to put up a fence for Shmita, or you lock them, that remains usher. The Chachamim never said that was okay. I mean, it was prohibited, and they left it prohibited. Halacha Chaf Hey. If you would sell it to a non-Jew, the halacha wouldn't apply, because the non-Jew doesn't have to keep the mitzvahs. Chaf Hey, Ein Shvius Nohegas Ela B'Eretz Yisrael B'Vad. Shmita is only observed in the land of Israel. When you will come to the land that I will give you, etc., then the land will rest a Shabbos for Hashem. And it applies when the Beis HaMikdash stands and when the Beis HaMikdash does not stand. And we'll see in a few halachas down the line, certain things apply. What doesn't apply when the Beis HaMikdash is not standing. So Rav Kook starts by saying Shmita was only observed. It's only a mitzvah that you had to observe it when our ancestors reached the main part of Israel and they captured it and distributed it to the different tribes, and everyone knew what their portion was. So that was 14 years after Yeshua. After Yeshua brought them, they fought for 7 years to conquer it, and then it was another 7 years that it took to distribute everything. Based on the Kesef Mishnah, Rav Kook says that Shmita. Okay, so the question is, what about nowadays? The Rambam says bein shelo b'fnei abayis, but the halacha is that, well, we'll see. I won't get ahead of ourselves. According to the Kesef Mishnah, Shmita applies nowadays from the Torah because it doesn't depend on having Yovel. Even though we don't have Yovel, and Yovel definitely only applies when the majority of the Jews live there. But Shmita is independent, so it applies nowadays. And also because he holds with, like the Rambam holds, that the sanctity of the land, the second sanctity of Chazaka, of the Ezra and people came and they just settled the land without a war, that's a permanent acquisition of, and the holiness of Eretz Yisrael remains. So there's two things going on here. So in regard to Kedushas Haaretz, this definitely, according to the Rambam's opinion, that the Kedusha, the second Kedusha remains. According to the Ravid, though, even the second Commonwealth, when the second Commonwealth ended, Eretz Yisrael lost its Kedusha. And then the second point the Kesef Mishnah says is that you might think that Shmita is dependent on Yovel, and Yovel definitely only applies when the majority of Jews live there, and but no, it's independent. So Shmita applies nowadays midiraisa. Now, in regard to the opinions about selling the land, the heter mechira, So most of the opinions who allowed it would go according to the opinion that Shmita nowadays is midrabana. So not everyone agrees with the Kesef Mishnah. We're going to see a little bit further, but that's a very important point. If it's only rabbinic, we could be more lenient in certain things because there's a general principle. If there's a doubt on a Torah level din, you have to be strict. If the doubt is only in a rabbinic din, you could be lenient. So according to this Kesef Mishnah, there would be a lot less room for leniency. And I've mentioned many times, and I don't have the answer, is according to, unfortunately, the population trends of Jews outside of Israel due to assimilation and intermarriage and stuff, whereas there's a lot of Jews in Israel and with a good overall positive birth rate, not that all segments of the population have a good birth rate. It does seem that in a few more decades, the majority of Jews in the world are going to be in Eretz Yisrael. So the question is, when we need Rov Yoshva Aleha, does that mean that that the population has to be from kibbutz golios, that people have to literally leave exiled lands and go to Eretz Yisrael to make it a majority? But just from the fact of demographic trends and birth rate trends, if the birth rate of Jews outside of Israel is so low, and the birth rate in Israel gets big enough that they will overtake, when does Kol Yoshva Aleha? I don't know. I don't know. Rav Kook continues, Tosos and Erevin, or it seems that it should be Erechin, and the Yereim and the Balaitor says that nowadays Shmita is only midrabana. And some say, even in the time of the Beis HaMikdash, even in the first Beis HaMikdash, once the tribes of Reuven and Gad and Chatzi Shevet and Rasha, meaning the ones who live on the eastern side of the Yarden, who we're going to read about in a few weeks in Parshas Maseh, so they were exiled much before everyone else because they were further away and not as more susceptible to foreign attack. And certainly in the days of Ezra, Shmita was only rabbinic. And the Balamor, I think the Balamor in Sefer Trumos says, nowadays, since we don't have based in of people who have received smicha in an uninterrupted chain from Moshe Rabbeinu, and we're not able to make years. We can't declare Rosh Chodesh based on witnesses and appoint Shmita years. Shmita is not even Rabbanan. It's just like a minhag. Keep Shmita, not to forget it, but it's not even rabbinic. So that's obviously the most very lenient opinion. No one relies on that really. And it's only a pious matter to keep Shmita, but this is just a very, it's not even a minority view, it's just this is one opinion and no one else holds it. And it appears that even according to that opinion, though, our ancestors who have always settled in Eretz Yisrael, even when there was no based in that was able to declare years or months, they still practice Shmita. As a remembrance of the obligation of the Torah obligation of Shmita, that it was practiced as if it would be when all the Jews would live in Israel. So historically, I don't know. I don't think there's any evidence one way or the other what happened in Shmita. Like even in the time, let's say 500 years ago, in the time of the Beis Yosef, the author of the Shulchan Aruch, 50 years, let's say, after the Spanish expulsion, and we know that there were communities of Jews. I don't know that we have any one way or the other records of saying what their Shmitas were like. Actually, that's not true. I may have seen a reference of one thing, but there's just no, as far as I know, there is very little just evidence at all, historical evidence one way or the other. Just because we don't have evidence doesn't mean people didn't keep Shmita. But I'm just saying what Rav Kook bases this on, that it appears that our ancestors who dwelled in Israel, even after many years ago. I don't know if he has a source for that. I mean, the one thing I would say is that normally, if you come to a place, you have to ask the people who come there, what do we do? So even though obviously, even 150 years ago, there were probably more, or starting sometime after the time of the Vilna Gaon, when the students started going up, and they were, making a very important percentage of the population, they probably would have, to the Jews who already live in there, say, what do we do for Shmita, or which year is Shmita? So there must have been something like that, but it's intriguing. Chavav, kol shechziku ba'olei baba, akaziv aser ba'avoda. Any place that those who came up from Babel, meaning the beginning of the Second Commonwealth, that they took chazaka, they left until Kaziv, you're not allowed to work the field. All of the sfichim that grow there, you're not allowed to eat because that's Shmita. But but if only the Jews in the time of Yehoshua captured it, but people who came up from Babel did not dwell there, to whom Gziv Adanara Bad Amana, which is from Gziv until the river until Amana. Now the river, if I'm not mistaken, there's at least 2 or 3 opinions about which river we're talking about here. I think the Kuzari, and it seems to be a unique opinion. Well, wait, hold on. I think the Kuzari makes it sound like it could even be the Nile River, which really makes very little sense, because according to that, when the Jews were in Mitzrayim, part of Egypt is considered Eretz Yisrael, and then the whole Sinai desert would be Eretz Yisrael because it's north of the Nile. So many opinions hold it's Wadi al Arish, and I saw that there are different opinions because some of the branches or tributaries, may have shifted, or there's a machlokas which of those tributaries is considered the one that we follow for the border. But just because to explain the Kuzari's opinion, I think we could explain it in the following manner. Well, there's two possible ways. I don't know if they're connected or not. So, according to the Kuzari, prophecy was given in Eretz Yisrael. So basically, the land that was promised to Abraham is Eretz Yisrael. And the thing is that not everything that was promised to Abraham was included in Eretz Yisrael from the time of Yoshua, because we're going to get 3 more lands, Kini, Knizi, and Admoni, when Mashiach comes. So it could be that, like, it may be that maybe, and this is a maybe, my next answer will be more definite, the Kuzari would hold that we're going to get half of Egypt or part of Egypt also after Mashiach comes, that was promised to Abraham. But an even better way to explain the Kuzari is because the Kuzari also says that prophecy happens in the land that was promised to Abraham, which is going to be Eretz Yisrael. That's where prophecy takes place. So it makes it sound like, and he says that Moshe Rabbeinu was able to get Nevuah in Mitzrayim, or the fact that Moshe got Nevuah in Mitzrayim shows that that's part of Eretz Yisrael, the land that was promised to Abraham. Because Eretz Yisrael is special, because in one of the ways that Eretz Yisrael is special is because you could receive prophecy in it. So again, that's it's not a widely held opinion, but combining that opinion, keeping that the other opinion of the Kuzari in mind helps us understand more of how he could say it goes all the way to the Nile. So because Moshe got prophecy in Mitzrayim, so at least part of Mitzrayim from there getting closer to Eretz Yisrael, I guess, would have a status of Eretz Yisrael for some things. Obviously, there's no Truma because the Bnei Yisrael didn't conquer it. But then I did see, I did find a sefer. Someone quoted something in it. I had to look through it real closely. And basically, this sefer was trying to say, let's say we learned about, in last week's parsha, Sichon and Og. So Sichon and Og were not even the land that they were supposed to conquer. So anyone that the Jews defeated militarily on their way from Mitzrayim to Eretz Yisrael, would that have a shame Eretz Yisrael? So they were giving an answer something along those lines. But I mean, if it wasn't promised to Abraham, even if they conquered it, it wasn't accepted as Eretz Yisrael. And then the other thing just that I have to mention before we go and see what Rav Kook says, I think we finished this. Hold on, let me just finish reading the Rambam. Before, so if the places that Olam Mitzrayim got, but the people from Bavel didn't go. Now remember, it is a machlokus how exactly they traveled in the Midbar. How far north up they went, because according to some opinions, they were very far up to the north, and then they came back down to Yericho. Some say most of the traveling was way down south and west of Eretz Yisrael. But you remember from Mitzrayim, they came up primarily from a south easterly direction and eventually conquered Eretz Yisrael. When they came up from Bavel is northwest, so they would be coming from maybe what we call the Golan Heights, but they were coming from the north. So they didn't go as far south as, obviously they went to Yerushalayim, but they certainly didn't go as far south as they had in the first Beis Hamikdash. So Kaziv to the river until Amana, Afapishu also Bavoda Shvius, even though we're not allowed to work the land on Shvius, on Shmita, Hasvichim Chantoncha B'Mutam Brachila. The stuff that grows itself there, the vegetables, you're allowed to eat it. And from the river in Amana and further, you're allowed to even work the land. Now, it seems I was looking in a few Svarim, even going back, 40, 50 years ago, and they're pretty strict on the boundaries of Eretz Yisrael. They're not trying to assume that any particular places and most of this farm basically said if it's basically in the borders of Eretz Yisrael, we don't work the land. So it seems to me that for whatever reason, people are strict and they don't assume that certain portions of the land are the Ole Bavel didn't reach. But in regard to Gush Katif, we saw a few months ago when we were speaking about the greenhouses, and if you cover up you separate the land and you have it in a raised bed. In Gush Katif, some poskim were okay to be lenient. So Gush Katif, which is in Gaza, so even though it's very unlikely that anyone from Bava went there, some poskim are willing to say, okay, we could use some leniencies there because it's not really Eretz Yisrael in regard to Shmita, because of the second people in the second Commonwealth don't live there. But even many we saw some big poskim who said even in Gush Katif don't rely on that. So it's interesting why people are so strict. And then I guess maybe just because they're not sure exactly where some places are, there were some places, maybe Beit Sha'an, or they said that they went around certain places so they would not have Kedusha Shvius in those places. In the second Beis Hamikdash, in the time of Ezra, they specifically went around certain locations as to not sanctify those places. And the reason would be that those places would be, I'm using this word oasis, that you'd be able to plant there on Shmita time. Because if they sanctified the whole land, then where they would have to import, they knew they were not a strong economic or militaristic people. So it seems that Ezra intentionally, left certain areas unsettled to not give them Kedusha so that it would be able to be plowed. So I don't know if it's because we're not sure exactly where those places are strict, but in the books that I looked in, I didn't see anyone who gave, particular places and said south of here and west of there, we could be more lenient, which was a little bit surprising, in my opinion, because talking about, so what about the boundaries that the Rambam mentions? Ksiv and Amana themselves, are they like in Eretz Yisrael or like outside of Eretz Yisrael? So they are like outside of Eretz Yisrael. But in Ksiv, you're not allowed to work the land, but you're allowed to eat Svichim. And Amana, you're allowed to even work the land. And that which the Rambam says you're allowed to eat the vegetables that grow there. So based on the Parsha Mishnah, the Rambam himself in his Rambam commentary, chapter 6, Mishnah Aleph, we say, nevertheless, there is sanctity of Shmita is observed there, even though it's not as strict as the growths of these plants or vegetables in Eretz Yisrael, in the main Eretz Yisrael, that they're completely prohibited. Now, things that grew in the places that the first Commonwealth conquered, but the second Commonwealth did not settle, you're allowed to eat them. And according to this, it's a kal v'chomer that sanctity of Shmita sanctity would be observed in for fruit that was either planted illegally, improperly, or by a goy. The Rash says that the din of bior, which is again, when it's not available in the field anymore, you have to declare it ownerless. That's the Ramban's opinion. We said the three opinions about that: the Ramban's opinion, the Ravid's opinion, and the Rambam, who says you actually have to destroy it by that time. So the din of bior does not apply in those places either. Places here where the Rambam says you don't have to keep it, you don't have to do bior there also. Because in this time of the Second Commonwealth, the Jews didn't live there, and in those cases, the fruit would be allowed to be eaten even after the time of the bior. And the Mishnah Lamelech has a doubt if this, according to this opinion, we wouldn't even treat the fruits from these areas with kedusha shvius at all. If there's no bior, that means there's no kedusha shvius either. Or it's only a leniency that you treat it with kedusha shvius, but you don't need a bior. But let's say you're not allowed to sell it, you're not allowed to waste it. So the question is, if the bior doesn't apply, no halachas apply, or bior doesn't apply as a special halacha, but the other regular laws of the sanctity of parish shvius do apply. He's not sure. And the Vilna Gaon in Shnos Eliyahu says that it's clear that in the places that we said that that you could eat their fruit on Shmita, you're still not allowed to work the land. They do not have sanctity of Shmita at all. And you could buy them, you could sell them, you could waste them. The Vilna Gaon is clear about that. Let's try to do one more halacha. Surya. So we usually translate Surya as Syria. It's not necessarily Syria, but it is a place northern that David HaMelech captured, and it's considered a private conquering, not a public national conquest. Even though Shmita is not kept on a Torah level there, the Chachamim decreed on it that you're not allowed to work the land on Shmita just like Eretz Yisrael. And the reason is, if we would allow people to work, people would leave Eretz Yisrael and go there for Shmita, or maybe even stay there not for Shmita. So in order to keep people living in Eretz Yisrael, they have to prohibit that. But there's certain places, the lands of Ammon and Moab and Egypt and Shinar, even though the Chachamim said you're obligated to give tithes from them on a rabbinic level, they said they didn't ever said at all that you have to keep Shmita. So in those places, there's not even a Shmita midrabanan. So says Rav Kook in Surya, which they decreed that you're not allowed to work the land. They only prohibited working stuff that's connected to the ground, but they did not prohibit anything that was detached. So let's say we said a few halachas ago about pressing the wine or drying the fruit, like the figs and stuff. You could do that in a completely regular way. And Ammon and Moab, what we said, Shmita is not observed there. The Tosfos has a doubt in Yevamos Daf Tezayin. What part of Transjordan of the east side of the bank are we talking about? Is that talking about the place that we read about in last week's parsha that Moshe and Bnei Yisrael conquered it from Sichon? And that land was conquered by Eretz Yisrael through this kibush, just like the Ever Yarden is considered Yisrael. However, Olei Bavel went out of their way to not re-sanctify it. And still, the Olei Bavel who did not conquer it, even though you can't eat it, you could eat from that land, you're still not allowed to work it. Or was there a reason that they made a distinction and they reduced the sanctity of Ammon and Moab was reduced, that there was no Shemitah at all? Or maybe anything that was already conquered in the time of Moshe and Yeshua, there's no difference. Even if the Olei Bavel didn't settle there, however, Shemitah is applied there, except in regard to eating from that land, they were lenient and said you're allowed to eat from that. So if so, Ammon and Moab that was conquered by Moshe is just like the rest of Eretz Yisrael. That in the places that the second Commonwealth from Bavel, that we treated Shmita, that you're not allowed to work the land, Ammon and Moab, which we say Shmita is not observed there, that means Ammon and Moab that not in the land that's Sichon, meaning Ammon and Moab had other lands, but where Moshe and Bnei Israel were, only that particular part is like Eretz Yisrael because it was conquered by the Jewish people in the time of Moshe, right before the time of Yeshua. But the other lands, so that land you're not allowed to work or eat from either. That which it said that you're allowed, that it doesn't Shmita is the parts of Sichon and Og's land that Moshe didn't conquer. And the crazy, what was that? The Kaftor V'Ferach, which is a book about Eretz Yisrael, says that Eretz Ammon was not captured. It's only talking about Eretz Moab, but the land of Ammon that was not captured and never sanctified as Eretz Yisrael, that's called Eretz Ammon Moab, and that's where Shmita is not conquered. So we're trying to figure out what land the Rambam is talking about here. So the several opinions. The last opinion here that we just said is, if it was the part that was not captured, the Torah calls that, the Chachamim call that Eretz Sichon Moab, even though it wasn't Moab's land. And is there a difference between the part that Moshe conquered? Is that, can we, and Ole Babel didn't do that, is that still usher to eat from that land or not? Or the place that Moshe conquered, you're not allowed to work the land there, but the parts of Sichon and Og that Moshe didn't conquer, those are the places you're allowed to eat from. So those are those possibilities. And we are up to Halacha Chav Ches, and we will leave it here. It's time for Mincha.